Welcome to today's KM World webinar, brought to you by SearchUnify. I'm Mary D. Ojala, Editor-in-Chief at KM World Magazine, and I will be the host for today's broadcast. Our presentation today is titled, From Struggle to Success, Knowledge Management Made Easy with GenAI. Now, let me introduce our moderator and speakers for today. Beth Coleman, Lead Consultant and KCS Trainer Catalink, Brian Corcoran, KCS Certified Practitioner and Cognitive Search Evangelist SearchUnify. And now, let me pass the event over to Beth Coleman, Lead Consultant and KCS Trainer Catalink.
Hi, Mary D. That's great to hear from you. Thanks so much for this opportunity. Brian and I are really excited to present Knowledge Management Made Easy with GenAI, and you are going to hear some great stuff about Knowbler as well. I'm excited to be able to add some information about Knowledge-Centered Service, KCS, and you might hear Brian and I geeking out a bit about that at the end when he does a presentation of Knowbler, and we'll be talking about how KCS applies within an AI environment. Over to you, Brian.
All right, thank you, Beth, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Brian Corcoran, and I am I'm a regional sales manager at SearchUnify, but I'm also our global knowledge and cognitive search evangelist. So I've spent over a decade in the space helping knowledge management practitioners make knowledge the key asset of their organization and make sure that value is being delivered from that content across a variety of different customer and employee touch points. So especially you can imagine the last 2 years with generative AI and a ton of use cases and experimentation. We've been at the forefront of that at SearchUnify, and we'll walk you through some different concepts today in terms of how fellow practitioners can leverage generative AI for different use cases. And then at the end, we'll also show a demo walkthrough of our app that we've developed called Knowbler. So look forward to having everybody for this session. Any questions come up along the way, we're happy to answer those and make sure they're addressed. Okay, so now that I've introduced myself, let's go ahead and just speak on SearchUnify really quickly. So SearchUnify is a unified cognitive technology platform. About 10 years ago, we started focusing on cognitive search use cases, search and findability, and again, being able to extract meaningful insights from knowledge across the enterprise and into the long tail. And so as a byproduct of that journey, we've also worked on developing a variety of different productivity apps, one of which we'll show today is Knowbler. And you can see that some of the primary use cases that we focus on are around knowledge management, customer self-service and support, internal intranet use cases, and even marketing and website search. So wherever a user needs to be connected with content, we tend to be right at that intersection. All right, so with that being said, and we've been doing a ton of experimentation over the last 24 plus months when it comes to generative AI. And what we just talked about, these different tasks and being able to leverage them within your knowledge management lifecycle. Some of the conversations we've had with practitioners is, their C-level executives, their board is coming to them and saying, you have to do something with generative AI. We need to see results. We need to see some experimentation. So the challenge is when you're throwing a transformative technology like generative AI and large language models into these use cases, what may be happening is that we might be trying to automate a process that isn't optimized. And so if we're just going to be throwing large language models and generative AI, and we have some challenges in terms of tapping into tacit knowledge or having a culture of contribution where everybody wants to contribute knowledge, but also make that knowledge better at each touch point, then really we're just going to be automating a mess and actually doing it faster than you would ever believe. And the best example we can come up with for you on that is that you'll just be shoveling sand with a pitchfork. So nobody wants to do that. You definitely need a shovel for that or something more powerful. And so what we will talk about today is several different things, but the key thing we want to hit home when you look at these large language models is that there's a lot of different risks or considerations that you need to bear in mind when you're approaching these technologies. And the potential for them is astronomical as well. But some of the key things we found is that, LLMs can perpetuate biases. If you're using a certain LLM for a different task than it was trained for, it might fall short. And I think the key thing that we're seeing here in red is that LLMs are data dependent. And especially if we think about it, LLMs are knowledge dependent, because whether it's a ChatGPT or like a Lensa AI in terms of generating text, images, all outputs that these large language models are creating are derivative works. They come from somewhere. So honestly, knowledge management has never been more important, because it can provide the guardrails for ensuring that the large language models perform correctly. So there are 5 key areas that we want to talk about, but Beth, let me just give you, sorry to jump ahead. Let me just give you a chance to share some insights in terms of what you've seen with practitioners, and if you've been running into some similar conversations so far.
Well, there's always the worry of security of information. And of course, those of us who are working with responding to people and answering questions, in that process, we're also worried about risk of letting out information that needs to be curated or needs to be reviewed and approved. And so having a means to do that quickly and easily is really important to us. But behind that, if we're going to be using LLMs, we want to have a tool that ensures we are picking up from curated content instead of going out to areas that we have no information about and no security. So it's very important to have the tool do that for us.
Absolutely.
That's my main comment.
No, I think that makes sense. And look at what you've seen over the last 2 years, where you'll see stories of Samsung banning everybody from using ChatGPT internally because some of their engineers were actually using ChatGPT for code reviews. So, you have to make sure that there's security aligned with the technology and making sure that the outcome you're generating is correct, but also you haven't jeopardized PII and confidential data at the same time. So I think this totally makes. I totally agree, Beth. And just to jump into like the next set. So there's a couple things we'll talk about today in terms of how fellow practitioners are using generative AI for their KM use cases. And you can see that there's basically 5 topics we're going to cover, and we'll do it pretty quickly. And as questions come up, please feel free to ask them as we go. So the first one that we are going to talk about is knowledge sourcing. Okay, and specifically the way to think about knowledge sourcing is that oftentimes we think about knowledge management being heavily siloed, right? Everybody has their own systems, different members of the organization, different teams. They're all using these different corpuses of knowledge. And how do you actually tap into that in a meaningful way, right? So the first thing we have to think about is, what are the corpuses of knowledge that we actually want to tap into? And this requires us to go and interview our teams and figure out, okay, is there actually a spot where the knowledge curation is happening, but we're just not able to tap into it because it's somebody's special corner. So I think the key thing is that we need to make sure that we are looking beyond a single siloed source. And then if we're thinking about how to actually pull that content using a large language model and then generating responses and being able to make that knowledge discoverable, again, we have to think about the right sort of LLM we want to use for this. So as a case in point, ChatGPT, Perplexity, right? Great for asking questions. Those aren't the types of LLMs I would want to take and then put into my self-driving car and expect to get from point A to point B safely. They're just designed to do different things. So I think what we're saying here is we want to pick the right large language model, and we can also use it for its linguistic capabilities, and we can cluster different drivers of information, different questions, cases. All of these things are possible. And then we can understand that once we have those sources defined, that's where we should be leveraging these sources for knowledge generation potentially. And so that'll be the next thing that we'll talk about. And we'll just start with, what we saw, about 2 years ago is, we'd be talking to organizations and certain team members would say, hey, I love ChatGPT. I'm actually throwing in some symptoms and I'm able to spit out a KB article. And what we've seen with the Samsung use case and other examples is that we want to make sure the outputs are strong and they're based on the interactions at hand. That way we're generating accurate content. But you also need to make sure if you're pulling content from interactions and trying to create new knowledge, you've got to have security, right? So in this case, there could be, PII masking is not happening. Customer data is just being passed through the system. And I think one of the big challenges is that if you're using a public or an open large language model, all that content that you're using should be already indexed by Google, because otherwise proprietary content is going to become part of training data sets that are owned by these large language model companies and not by you. So I think it's important to make sure that we're factoring in that generation is important, but we need to have the source data. And the key thing that we've seen for search over the last 15, 20 years is that I've never met two teams that have the same exact sets of taxonomy and metadata and an overarching content structure. And so you can imagine that when you're pulling in all of these different corpuses of information and there's different taxonomies and just different verbiage, how are you supposed to actually ensure that the answers being generated are actually worth merit? And the challenge is that for large language models, a lot of this stuff needs to be labeled. You need to have a smart approach in terms of the taxonomy, clear instructions. And what's funny is a lot of those things are manual. So, classically, if you would just try to do all this tagging manually, it's kind of like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you get to one side, you've got to start, painting your way back down the other side. So I think using large language models for structuring is also very important, because then we can say that we have different capabilities to connect our end users based on the voice of their workflows, whether it's a customer, partner, employee, it doesn't matter. So structuring is very important. And then once we have that structure, the next thing that we'll cover is knowledge discovery, right? So we had number one, identifying the sources and making sure we understand what is the corpus of information that our knowledge workers need. The second thing was looking at knowledge generation, so we can actually make that knowledge available to our end users. The third was the structuring, to make sure that we have the capability to locate the correct content and use that as the basis for our answers. And now we're looking at knowledge discovery itself. And so, a few things to consider here is some of the risks that come into the knowledge discovery approach. Because again, if you just take a ChatGPT style approach, you might be missing some of the key considerations and risks. And, we can see some of those, but, garbage in, garbage out. I mean, you can't expect your large language model to come up with an intelligent answer if you don't have the content available for it. And then also thinking about, limited context in terms of the business or a customer context, the risk of training on outdated data, limited personalization, and limited access controls. And you can also see, one of the key things that we worry about in the industry is hallucination, right? And it makes no sense to enable your employees or customers to access confidently incorrect answers if it's just going to create additional friction, right? So that goes back to automating the mess and shoveling sand with a pitchfork. So the ideas that we have when it comes to knowledge discovery, and these are two of the industry best practices that we wanted to discuss really quickly, is that you might be looking at trying to fine-tune a large language model and use it for its knowledge capabilities. And there's also a secondary approach, which is more about building context and using what's called a retrieval augmented generation pipeline. And we'll cover what both of those are, because I think this is really important to understand that based on your content and how dynamically it changes, you don't want to enter technical debt when you're leveraging large language models. And there's a couple things to call out here. So this is just an example of a fine-tuning lifecycle, right? We have to select a pre-trained model, right? And again, it goes back to what we talked about before. We need to use a model that's trained on the task that we want to deliver. So again, have to be very smart about the models that we're choosing. Then we have to define the task, right? Classification, entity extraction, translation. We have to prepare the data. And then we have to choose a fine-tuning strategy. Then we've got to configure this model. And then we have to fine-tune the model and train it on specific tasks and data, right? So basically, we're taking somebody else's toddler and we're trying to teach it to do, to basically live in our house. So, there can be some success there. And what we find in these use cases for fine-tuning, medical use cases, content that doesn't update as regularly as a dynamic knowledge management use case. This is where fine-tuning can potentially work, because you're going to have to continue iterating and improving and testing the model. And the catch with fine-tuning is that anytime new content is being added into the model, you have to do the consistent retraining. So for some organizations, this could work. But when we think about some of the costs that we see associated with fine-tuning, it's the resource intensiveness, it's the fact that you need highly labeled content, you have higher levels of complexity that requires data scientists. We have a few on our team, so we completely understand, what the human cost element is in trying to deliver these types of outcomes using fine-tuning. And really, if you think about it, the hallucinations, when you add too much content into fine-tuning models, it creates friction, but also it prevents scalability. So Beth, I know I've motor mouthed here for a second, and we're going to go into the other way that you can generate answers. But in terms of what you see with the organizations that you're consulting with, I mean, I would imagine one of the key concerns is our knowledge updates pretty regularly. So, what are you seeing out there, and are there any concerns in terms of, hey, we're using an LLM, but we might be pulling the wrong data or outdated data?
Yeah, I think there's a big question around what are the roles that need to be taking this up. And there's always the element of concern as to whether an average knowledge worker who's working in this tool is getting what they need to do the work they're doing. So usually there is an emphasis, and that was a great model for what goes on in fine-tuning. There is an emphasis now on bringing people in to do that engineering and science of analysis in fine-tuning. And anyone who has done that work with ChatGPT knows that it takes time. So what we're aiming to achieve first is understanding how we can alleviate those hallucinations and ensure that anyone who is using anything in creation of knowledge for curation or for structure is enabling a different way of approaching access to content. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. Is that right? The other
absolutely.
way.
Yeah, and I think the other way makes a lot of sense. Think about it like this. Like in the time we've been on this call, how many times has content in SharePoint been updated? How many times has your knowledge base been updated? So each time those updations happen, you're going to have to look more at the fine-tuning, the cost of doing it. Not to say it's not an interesting and value-driven approach, but I think for enterprise knowledge management, there are best practices that might align better. And what we are going to discuss is the retrieval augmented generation pipeline. All right, at SearchUnify, we call this FRAG because we're actually federating multiple sources into the RAG pipeline. And that's one of the key differences, is that when you're looking at fine-tuning, you're basically just building a swath of information, right? And the thing is that how do you know with confidence that the right information is being pulled by that fine-tuning model and put into what should be the basis for the answer generation? And the thing is, it's kind of a black box. What we find with retrieval augmented generation, if anybody's used like a paid version of ChatGPT, or if you think about Bing search, we've seen these concepts publicly. Or even looking at Perplexity. I was using it the other day. I asked it the question. The first thing it did is it showed me the sources, right? And why does it do that? Well, what RAG does is RAG is basically using a search mechanism as the lookup for the content and the context. So imagine this, like we've got multiple corpuses of knowledge that we want to leverage for generated answers and personalized responses. How do we control security? We should be doing that at the source level. We can use connectors to respect those permissions and then make sure that if a search query is asked by that user, we can do the lookup of the different content sources, their permissions, other personalization based on who they are as a user and what they've consumed before. It will send that as a vector, with a vector database. We'll basically take those results and we'll send it to a large language model, right? And so the approach there is that it doesn't matter what large language model it is, provided it's the right one for these types of use cases. But the idea is that you're using search as the lookup to then take the most relevant results, give a prompt to the LLM to say, hey, based on these results, I want you to answer the question that was asked. And this is traditionally where you see answers being given and then citations. And I come from the academic world 20 years ago where you had to show your work on everything. So citations, if nothing else, they build trust in the content that already exists. And also it builds trust in the people who create and curate that content. So, as we can see here with RAG, search is important. And whether LLM organizations know this by now, and I'm sure they do, every LLM company is a search company now. Because if you want to use retrieval augmented generation, you have to have the context correctly understood, and you have to take the correct content to power these responses.
And the beauty of this too, Brian, I think, is the option to take information from various sources and to manage that easily.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a great call out, Beth, is that, We could pull in issue resolving details, case resolving details, from a variety of corpuses of information, right? The cool thing there is that it will amplify the intelligence of our content by answering questions that have already been asked before, because the content helps already do that. But the beauty of what we're seeing is aggregating multiple sources of information or multiple results from across different sources to answer questions that have never been asked before. And I think that's the beauty of the large language model is, again, we're not trying to train a large language model to become a knowledge bot. We're taking the content and asking the LLM to do what it's been trained on, which is use its linguistic capabilities to then create that content and deliver confidence in that knowledge.
And structure it.
Yes, absolutely. You need the structure for that. Couldn't agree more. So the last piece is that if we think about the generation of our content and making sure that it is amplified to the right people at the right time when they need it most, we also need to think about the after effects of that. And this is what we'll cover in our Knowbler demonstration as well. But you need to make sure that you actually have a lifecycle management piece to look at the quality of the content. And there are some components from KCS that we'll kind of unpack with you to show you this. But I think the after reviews on content are just as important as everything that we talked about before the answer is generated. Or else, how are you supposed to know that your LLM didn't generate the right sort of outcomes, and we've just been able to automate dead ends for our end users? We don't want that. We need to see how the content actually performed. So Beth, I think the key takeaways we have there is that the retrieval augmented generation, or FRAG, can help unlock value from content that exists in your organization today and content that will exist in your organization in the future without as much cost of having to retrain the large language model with a fine-tuning approach. And again, RAG is all about setting the content and context parameters, and that's why search is important, because if we're pulling in the results and we are not able to answer the question accurately, we can say, look, based on the context we have with this content, we're not able to answer the question, instead of getting the hallucinations, which I've seen with ChatGPT as well. I asked ChatGPT a year ago, who is SearchUnify's biggest client? And I got this 4-paragraph response about this lovely client that I'd love to work with. The problem is they've never been our client. So they told me the success story that I might, maybe it's forecasting my future, but it just confidently gave incorrect answers. And I think those are the things that's the experience that will stop generative AI in its tracks, is that if you're just more frustrated using the new technology than the traditional hacks that you have in place, that's where the rubber's not going to meet the road. Let's go ahead and pop into this slide, and if you could just share with the audience a little bit more about the inner workings of KCS.
Yeah, so KCS is a methodology, and it can be applied in management of knowledge, particularly around the capture and structure of knowledge, which is the area that is really relevant here. Of course, we also like to reuse knowledge, and we like to reuse knowledge that's been created through a method of review. We make sure that our articles are reviewed to the right level of safety or security and trust that it is accurate. So we can put in various methods of review, but there is always the review process to validate the content. The other one is improve. Making sure that we can actually ask people in our workflows to be able to look through content and identify where there are edits that need to be made, and to be able to make them. So there's a lot of work around roles in this methodology, giving people permissions to do things that they aspire to do, such as publishing content very quickly, and also manage domains of knowledge. So everyone gets to have a chance to play in this. It's a team sport. And capturing the information in the very beginning is essential, making sure that we get the context of the customer. So while we're talking to the customer or hearing from the customer in whatever way, whatever channel, we need to take into consideration how they're phrasing things, so that when we add that context into the articles that we share with them, they will have an easier time of finding the article later. And so our effort really needs to be making sure our customer gets the easiest channel information that they need, whatever channel they go to, and that they are able to solve or answer their question themselves. So we have to write to that end. Of course, we create content in this methodology also for our own use in solving, analyzing, and then sharing that analysis with others so they can use it. So there's complexity here. And designing the method for that, putting the roles in place initially, takes a little time, but ultimately what we end up with is a really good engine for capturing context and enabling us to create content. And the tools that we use need to assist. So Knowbler, which we're going to show you soon, is one of those tools designed to assist with this KCS process, which involves answering questions, analyzing the problem, creating the solution, and then capturing it into a knowledge article. Now, if you're working in any part of the organization, finance, HR, any other part of the organizations besides IT, you'll be asking IT, probably asking IT, to help you with your knowledge base. The other benefit of having great tools is that IT can help those departments to do that. Now, they can also do it on their own, depending on what tools they have. And this tool makes it easier for those groups to create their own knowledge bases and follow the same methodology that is being used very often in IT, KCS. So over to you, Brian.
So I think one thing we wanted to if you want to peel back the onion a little bit, Beth, I think when people see the double helix and solve and evolve, sometimes they'll say, those are a lot of steps, right? How do I actually go about doing that? And I think you called out a really, really interesting caveat a second ago, is that, KCS used to stand for knowledge-centered support. Now it stands for knowledge-centered service. And that basically means that wherever there's a responder and a requester, this type of methodology can be used, because think about how many times HR is being asked the same sort of benefits questions, and legal is getting asked by sales repetitive questions, right? There has to be a way to make that knowledge consumable, because the people who are responding are actually overqualified to spend their time responding again and again. So I think the key thing, Beth, with the solve loop is that, we want to understand, have we seen this issue before? Do we want to capture knowledge? And that lends into Knowbler. But are there any points, or tips on the solve loop, or, things that might be interesting for folks who are just getting started?
Yeah, so if you're getting started with content and you have a need for some structure, there is a method that we like to use, which is associated with content health, which is known as the content standard checklist. And we do a review of our quality of content regularly. Everyone should be able to do this and self-test if they wish. It's great if you have that capability and the tool to assist you with that while you're writing. Another aspect of it is enabling others to review your content easily. So if you have multiple sources and you're creating after you find there's nothing there that solves a problem, you want others to have a look at it and be able to review it. That's the most important aspect of this, is giving people the opportunity to jump in and help others. As I mentioned, it's a team sport. So collaboration is a big part of this, collaborating on articles to get them up to the customer very quickly. And one other way that we look at content in terms of improving its quality is that flag it or fix it. So we can give people the opportunity to look at an article, identify where there is a problem with it, maybe a slight change, minor change, or needs a rewrite. And they should either be able to fix that themselves if they have the permission to do so, or to send it off to somebody else who can help. And so understanding who that person should be is also a big factor in our speed of getting the article finished. And that's an important part of what tools can bring us as well. Making sure we can get the right article to the right person for review if needed.
I think that's a great recap.
A lead?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And the thing is, we're going to show exactly how this works. And no surprise that based on how we're talking about this methodology, there's always been elements of people, process, and technology. But now we're seeing that with large language models, it's not about just saying, oh, we're just going to automatically create KB articles. Like, we just want to also have the human element, as Beth was saying. So I think whether it is the methodology or the technology, we still need to make sure that it's human-centric. And so let's go ahead and jump into a demo of Knowbler. We'll just show a couple different ways. It's very easy in terms of being able to connect Knowbler, use it within an issue resolution workflow, and then we'll show the content reviewer examples too. And I'll be mindful of the time. We'll try to make this as short as we can. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll go ahead and do a very quick walkthrough. Okay, and Beth, I'm flying a little blind here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, all right, fantastic. So Knowbler has its own admin panel, and basically when we want to configure Knowbler at an interaction point, we're going to set it up by using a client. And so in the examples that we have, SearchUnify, we tend to work more with customer support, self-service use cases. We are continuing to develop a variety of different endpoints where we can plug in Knowbler. But just to show you a basic example, if we're thinking about a customer service team, first thing we'll do is we want to understand where is the interaction happening with the customer. So in this case, it could be a CRM, a support desk like Salesforce. You can see Zendesk, Dynamics, ServiceNow, and the like. And we have others that are coming out later this quarter. Once we connect the interaction point, which is the service desk, then we have our KB endpoint, right? So where is the knowledge that we're going to capture in the living? So again, we can map it to any of these different endpoints, and we also have different endpoints like SharePoint, Confluence that we're also working on. So you may see certain big technology providers that are focusing on knowledge generation, but those platforms are trying to create stickiness for their platform. We're trying to say that Knowbler can be ubiquitous. So if your agents are solving issues, but you use SharePoint as your corpus of knowledge, it should still be just as easy to generate that content and then get it into the right place where then others can use it. So once we've made the connection, then we'll just map the fields to a template. And so this is also a KCS best practice, is understanding content standard. What sort of content do we want available for users to take advantage of? This could be, in technical support, it could be a how-to, a troubleshooting KB article. You could also apply this for, benefits type KB articles and things like that. So it really is ubiquitous across the enterprise, but the way we started was with the support use cases. So this allows us, we can basically come in and we can map the interaction fields that are important, and then we can also use this as the basis for generating knowledge. How do we want that template to set up? And Beth, we talked a lot about structure, right? And this is a way that we can auto structure the knowledge that is going to be generated. So then it's not like, oh, cool, I took some symptoms, plugged it into ChatGPT, now I still have to edit the article. We want to try and do as much heavy lifting with the large language model as possible and turn knowledge workers into knowledge reviewers, even frontline workers. So just to show what this looks like within a case management flow, and you may have like a search widget that could be delivering generative AI answers. Where do you get that content from? It has to come from your knowledge base, right? So let's say that in this instance with Knowbler, we resolved a customer issue and we did a lot of research and checked back and forth with our team. Maybe we aggregated multiple sources of information, but we were able to solve the issue. And the thing is that it's not the last person who's going to ever have this question. So what can we do? Let's create knowledge as a byproduct of the interaction. Now, for the last 15, 20 years, when it comes to KCS, a lot of this has been creating the article as you are solving an issue. What we're saying is that that's very well intended, but now when you have a large language model that you can use for the linguistic capabilities, let people do their jobs by helping answer these requests and then naturally extract the most meaningful knowledge that can be reused by others. So here, if I wanted to create an article, we can pick the template based on what we set up in our admin panel. And then in this instance, this is, like a how-to style KB article. We've got the title is being pulled from the case. And then we're also using the generative AI piece, the large language model, to actually take some of these fields. We plug it in and send it to a closed large language model. So there's no danger in terms of confidential information getting out. And you can also scrub PII and confidential data. And then the output that you'll get can be something like this. We can have problem, cause, workarounds, step-by-step resolutions. It really just depends on, what is the end state that your knowledge workers would be trying to achieve. Let's just give them the structure and the capability to say, that looks good. Let me spend my time actually refining the article instead of doing all the heavy lifting, and then somebody else is going to have to review it. So the beauty here is that when we go to save the article, in KCS, there are different workflows. As Beth was saying, some people are licensed to publish knowledge directly into a production endpoint. Others are less experienced, so they haven't earned that right. So we can save articles as a draft, or we can publish and we can get them into the endpoint immediately so they can be consumed, whether it's a Salesforce or SharePoint or something like that. And Beth, you talked about reviews, right? And we talk about knowledge. Every use of knowledge is a review, but we also want to think about our content standard. And so before we even save this article, we have some content standard checklist capabilities that are here that will tell this knowledge worker, hey, it looks like the uniqueness of this article and the accuracy aren't too bad. So those are decent parameters. And we also have others that are coming online. So then what we're trying to do is enable that curator to do some more of the review themselves before it actually goes to the reviewer. So, but if you just save this and publish the article, then it goes directly into your knowledge base or wherever that endpoint is that we've set up. Now, Beth, that's one part of it, right? The other part is what happens when we actually have to review that content as a coach or a knowledge manager. So we also have a reviewer mode in Knowbler, and this allows us where any content that's been created, we can go in and we can actually review it. And so here we have a predicted score in terms of the quality of the content, but then we can actually click here and we can read through this article. And then we can decide, okay, is this article unique? Yeah, it is. Is it complete? No. Is the content clear? Yes. Accurate title? Yes. Maybe no links valid, no metadata correct. What I've just done is called content standard checklist. It's part of the evolve loop in KCS. And the beautiful part about Knowbler and how we've been thinking about this is that for the last 2 decades, anybody doing this activity has had to use spreadsheets, right? So the concept of the article being unique, clear metadata. This is a traditional kind of view in terms of what that process traditionally looked like. Now we've been able to do it directly within an admin panel or a reviewer panel. And when we go over to look at our analytics, we can see how many articles have we captured that are still not published versus the articles that are published. So if we've got massive backlogs, how many times is the question that somebody has, the answer to it is in this backlog, right? So how can we make sure that we're reducing publishing time drastically? And then the other pieces to call out would be reviewing those agents or those knowledge workers and developing coaching opportunities to figure out, well, where was your content good, but also where did it need work? So, here we can see that there's out of 5 articles, 3 were complete, content clear. So that means 2 articles need work. And then here there's 3 articles with metadata issues. So the cool thing is that when we identify what those issues are, we bucket them right here. So then you can self-organize as a team and say, all right, team, we've got 5 articles where we've got incomplete titles or bad metadata. Now we can self-organize, we can go fix these things. And I think the key thing we're looking at is when you fix those and you continue to create knowledge as a byproduct of your interactions, think about the amount of requests that responder may get. In a customer support use case like this, we can show the types of case drivers that exist and then the overlapping knowledge that should help answer that question. So you can see here, we've got this one case driver has about 15 articles around it. So if we were to ask a query to troubleshoot an issue associated with that case driver, we're probably going to get a decent answer because we have some good content. But this case driver or this request has no knowledge around it. So we're going to get a dead end automatically. So I think the review and the understanding of how your enterprise content will actually connect with users, massively important. And one of the last reports as well is that we're also giving you some recommendations where we say, look, we've scanned your interactions, we've scanned the knowledge and have analyzed the connections and overlap, but also the disconnects between the two. These are the topics that you should be working on, right? So now we can even start, investing our time in curating this sort of content. We still use Knowbler at the point of need, but these are some of the topics we can invest resources in, because if we fill these gaps, then our employees, customers, partners, they're all going to be able to find the information they need faster. And when you turn on a large language model, that's where you get beautiful answers, good citations, and trust in the content, which ultimately that's what you want out of your large language model. You want people saying, wow, those answers are great, but hey, I didn't even realize that those answers are there the whole time, because hey, that KB article is 2 years old. So I think those things are very interesting for Knowbler. And just to stop sharing my screen and just do a quick recap for everybody. So for the recap, let's just go through it really quickly. We're facilitating the creation of on-demand knowledge, right? We're leveraging the LLM for its linguistic capabilities. There's an integrated content review and publishing workflow. And we can also make sure we have insights into that knowledge across the entire life cycle. And there's certainly more to it, but I think that's an adequate demo for the session. And with that being said, we have a quick customer success story from one of our clients, Centellus. And so these are some of the outcomes that when they've plugged in Knowbler and then used their search solution, they're able to see that they've increased knowledge drastically. By making knowledge available to end users, people are consuming that knowledge a lot more. And also too, as a byproduct of that, because those users are finding the information they need in self-service before creating a case, their case volume is beginning to drastically reduce. And again, the knowledge is available because we've already curated it based on interactions that have already happened. And we don't want to waste our time continuing to solve those issues when we're overqualified to do so. So again, I think the effort reduction in creating knowledge is key, but also you want to make sure that you're getting the correct outcomes, which is the engagement. And we can see here that they've been able to scale that in a very, very positive way. And so there's some testimonials we have, but we'll go ahead and skip that slide. And Beth, this is basically the last slide is basically the road ahead for Knowbler. So we're working on a few things such as new versus known analysis, but like a unified content KB, and really thinking about all the corpuses of information and how we can publish into multiple endpoints based on who the user is. That way, if a product expert is answering a question somewhere, they can actually get the knowledge back into the right repository so it can then be leveraged by search and by large language models.
Fabulous. Yep, so Brian, I'd just like to say we're very excited to see the road ahead includes link accuracy insights.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's where we're still working on using the LLM for the linguistic capabilities, whether it's link accuracy, metadata accuracy, and being able to make suggestions to that user where we can say, look, we're pre-selecting these, but still we want the human element. Are these correct? Because that will make the identification of those links and metadata even more accurate as we go.
Absolutely. Fabulous.
And I would like to thank our speakers today, Beth Coleman, lead consultant and KCS trainer, Catalink, Brian Corcoran, KCS certified practitioner and cognitive search evangelist, SearchUnify,